Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Tomnuit toko ingoa, ko Spark aho I mahi ana. Spark was one of the founding signatories of the Climate Leaders Coalition, and our CEO, Jolie Hodson, is the convener of the CLC steering group. And I've got the privilege of representing CLC today and facilitating today's masterclass. So thanks everyone for coming along to today's session. It's a special masterclass delivered in partnership with Toitū Envirocare, and this builds on the Mark's session. So in the audience, we've got a combination of Climate Leaders Coalition signatories and also Toitū clients as well. So a big welcome to everyone. In today's session, we're going to explore what happens once science-based targets and associated emissions reduction pathways have been set. And we're going to cover how and when targets and pathways can be updated as the science shifts and as new technologies are introduced and things change. So it's a relevant topic for Spark as well. We set our own SBTI verified target in 2021 against the 2020 baseline. And we're in a sector where technology evolves a lot and our business evolves with it. So we want to ensure we continue to hold ourselves accountable against the latest climate science and that our target remains locked and tied to a 1.5 degree pathway. And over the last couple of years, we've had some changes in our own business scope. We've divested some of our passive mobile tower assets and also acquired an infrastructure field services business as well, a controlling stake in that. So we've got some rescoping and considering ourselves to do and how we continue to make sure our target evolves as our business changes. So if this is the first of these 3 sessions you're attending, we would encourage you to look at the other sessions as well. And those will be shared in a follow-up email with you. So getting into it, we're fortunate to have 2 speakers joining us today. We've got Steve from Toitū and Jamie from Toyota. So Steve will speak for the first half of the session, and JB will then share Toyota's experience, followed by a Q&A at the end. So introducing Steve Schoultz. Steve is Technical Account Manager at Toitū Envirocare, where he specializes in guiding clients through carbon certification programs. With his expertise in full value chain measurement and science-based targets, he helps clients achieve their sustainability goals while managing their carbon footprint, and is a great person to have as a speaker with us today. We're lucky to have him. So I'll now hand over to Steve.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. I'll just share my screen and we will kick on. Right. Can you all see that okay? Cool. Yep. So as Tom's mentioned, this is the 3rd webinar in our science-based target series. In parts 1 and 2, we covered the actual setting of the SBTs in some detail. And today we're going to cover the reduction pathways. So that's around, once you've set the targets, how do you get to the end goal? So to refresh, let's start with a simplified kind of approach to emissions reductions. Stage 1 is the managed stage. So based on the standard business rule around you can't manage what you don't measure. Now, if you've watched the previous webinars, you will have seen that the carbon measurement stage is becoming a lot more, shall we say, comprehensive with the increasing focus on full value chain. Now, also covered in the previous webinar was the setting of the science-based targets themselves. And in some ways, setting the targets under SBT is more straightforward because the level of reduction required is well defined. So for many of you, that will be 4.2% per year. And these targets are likely to be significantly more ambitious than the reduction targets that you may have previously set. So really the big challenge becomes not so much setting the targets, but more around figuring out how you're going to get there. And so that's the focus of today's webinar. So just to be clear, the reduction pathway plotting is all about gaining confidence that you can achieve the percentage reduction targets by your specified target year, and involves looking for different emission reduction opportunities, assessing them, and then prioritizing them for action. So we looked at supplier engagement targets in some detail in webinar 2. So in today's session, we'll be largely focusing on pathway plotting using absolute targets. So during the presentation, there are a couple of key principles or concepts that we'll cover off, and that includes the impact of sector averages versus supplier intensity rates, quite an important one, and the location of your possible projects, or sometimes called interventions along the value chain. And of course, being mindful of perverse outcomes previous webinar, the possible. So only the residual or hard to abate emissions should be offset or neutralized. So in this context, when we talk about removals, we're referring to the drawing down of existing gases and storing them either in nature-based forms such as forests or engineered technologies such as direct air capture. Now, the term hard to abate is obviously up for interpretation, where one company might say a particular emission source is unable to be reduced any further, whereas other companies might think differently and say, well, actually, I can avoid or at least reduce that emission. But regardless of how you define it, the idea of the mitigation hierarchy is that it's continuously reviewed and tested. So, for example, some options that you avoid now might be too far over the horizon, too costly, and so on, but they might be feasible in the intermediate or longer term. So the idea is to keep coming back to it and reviewing. And then just to confirm that the hierarchy is all about reducing the gross emissions and not the net emissions, i.e. removals are absolutely a last resort. So when it comes to looking for reduction projects that you can implement, there is a bit of a process to it. Now, when we're talking about projects, it's also timely to note that I use the term project loosely. In other words, projects won't necessarily be some discrete fixed piece of work done in a fixed period of time and then job done. Many reductions will require on interventions that are sort of baked into the business, part of BAU, and continually improved over time to optimize the savings. So an example would be anything related to reducing emissions from staff behavior, for example. Think of staff being trained to operate machinery efficiently. This will likely require ongoing tracking to ensure it's happening. And of course, including more training for new staff that come into the business. So the order in how you tackle searching for reduction options is up to you. But from our experience, the very first place to start is to really fully understand your inventory. And from that, you will see where to concentrate your efforts. So in the first instance, analyze the inventory. And in most cases, you'll want to focus on the largest emission sources. But there are some examples or some exceptions to that principle. For example, managing refrigerants. So say you had a chiller system which had a high stock holding of refrigerants, then a really good maintenance system should be in place to minimize the risk of system failure and leakage to the atmosphere. So that's because many refrigerants, as you'll know, have a very high global warming potential. And so if you were to have a leak, all of a sudden, all of your carefully laid plans for reductions may be completely dwarfed by one refrigerant leakage event. So, keeping an eye on those high risk areas to ensure that your plans don't get thrown aside. Now, in addition, less significant sources should still get some attention. If there are any obvious opportunities, i.e. any low-hanging fruit, then it's worthwhile looking at these and getting some runs on the board, particularly if there's any sector precedent or general stakeholder expectation around those particular emission sources. Now, once we know what the emission sources are to focus on, we can then search for different opportunities to reduce. From our own program experience, we've seen companies successfully use a combination of the methods shown here in the blue boxes. But one particular one that I should mention is supplier dialogue. So we do see various Toitū clients using this method, but it could be used a lot more, I believe, for uncovering opportunities. So especially as companies move that focus from not just the operational scope 1 and 2, but further up and down the value chain emissions. Following this process of identifying particular or potential reduction projects, we can establish a collated list of potential projects to reduce. And these can then be shortlisted by applying some screening checks. So we've found that the key criteria include reduction potential, time horizon, and cost. But the level of detail that you dip into for the screening will depend on things like the scale of the project, ease of implementation, and of course your own company policy on budget approval, sign off, and so on. So for example, for bigger projects, you may well need marginal abatement cost curves, rate of return calculations, etc., in order to justify going ahead with the project. So this shortlisting then produces a prioritized list for plotting out on a reduction pathway and assessing if you have a pathway that will meet or exceed your science-based targets. Worth mentioning finally that before moving on, you may find the need to circle back around the process in order to nail down a list of projects that will meet your targets. So this could require rechecking your prioritized list and so on. Now, there are a couple of things that are really important to bear in mind when you're selecting projects and implementing. And one of those is around the level of completeness and accuracy of your emissions, because this will influence the ability to both identify opportunities and to track the success of the implemented projects. So again, it's important to fully understand how the emissions were calculated in order to appreciate where the reduction levers are for any given emission source. So let's explain with a basic example. So many emission sources can be calculated using a range of factor options, and those are calculated with different activity data units. So in this particular example, I drove 1,000 kilometers in my medium-sized petrol car. My actual liters consumed was 60 liters of regular petrol, and that cost $168. Now I can calculate my emissions using liters consumed, which is the most accurate option, or I can calculate using kilometers traveled, dollars spent, and so on. So as you can see, if I were to choose, in this example, medium car for kilometers traveled, I'm actually over-calculating my emissions. And that's because the default fuel efficiency that's built into that kilometer factor is higher than the actual fuel efficiency of my vehicle. And of course, in this case, emissions from dollar spent is undercalculated because the built-in default dollar per liter rate is higher than the actual rate I purchased my fuel for. So if we then sort of extend that scenario and look at it, scenario 2 here, in this scenario, I've driven the same distance using the same car, but I've driven more efficiently through a combination of efficient driving, optimal tire pressure, perhaps I got rid of the golf clubs in the boot. And so I've managed to go the same distance, but only using 50 liters of petrol. So as you can see in the chart, the only emission factor that is accurately showing that reduction is the liters. The kilometers doesn't show a reduction because I'm still in a medium-sized car. And in this scenario, the dollar spend method didn't show a change because the default price rate hadn't been updated to reflect rising fuel prices. So I suppose the key point from this example is that for reduction planning, is that when you're scanning for reduction projects, you need to be able to interpret how the outcomes of that project will flow through to your inventory. So this example is primarily addressing vehicle fleets, but the principles are equally applicable across all of the emission sources. So that leads quite nicely onto reduction levers. And so reductions in your emissions can be achieved via what we call levers, the activity lever and intensity lever. So in the previous example, yes, I can reduce emissions by reducing the activity, i.e. if I were to travel less kilometers. But if I have to travel the same distance, then we really need to look hard at how to travel that same distance in a less intensive manner. So seen as in the previous examples, emission factors that you're using have a considerable role to play on the intensity lever. So another angle to consider for emission factors is what the longer term outlook is, or the rate of change, and if they'll follow a downward trend. So if we have a look at the, in this example, a road freight example, but it equally applies to all emissions in your value chain. The top line shows the actual industry average emissions per tonne kilometre 2019 to 22, as published in the MFE guidance. As you can see, there's only a small downward change, about a 0.7% decrease. So if we were to make an assumption, and just to stress, this is a high-level assumption, if this rate of change continues, we can project the emission factors to track across on a very narrow or very shallow downward trend out to 2030. But if we were to contrast this with an actual supplier-specific factor on the line underneath, firstly, you would note that it starts off on a lower intensity than the industry average. And the second point to make is that if this supplier is a leader in the industry and chasing their own science-based targets and reductions, we can project a much steeper downward trend per tonne kilometre. The flip side of this is that if your supplier is becoming more efficient, but you're only measuring based on industry average, then you won't see the benefit of that hard work. So I think the key message here is that by moving more and more of your inventory calculation from industry averages, spend-based analysis, and so on, to supplier-specific data, you have the potential to open up a much greater reductions via the intensity lever. So yeah, that's quite an important one that needs consideration. Now, we talked a bit about perverse, or I mentioned perverse outcomes. So once you've identified your opportunities, it's important to make sure that there are no unintended or perverse either environmental and or social outcomes that occur. So a couple of examples would be, for example, a project that reduces emissions but results in more water use where water resources are scarce, or sourcing first generation biofuels that create competition with food producing land. And we could have a project that achieves good reductions over a short sort of 2 to 5 year time frame. But if that project results in locked-in operational asset that compromises the ability to continue reducing into the longer term, you could have a problem. So in this example, switching from plastic packaging to slightly lower carbon alternative. But if you lock yourself in through the purchase of specific plant and equipment, then that may limit your choices in the longer term. Another example would be replacing a coal boiler with a gas boiler would have the same impact. So avoiding those perverse outcomes where possible. Another thing to consider is the talking about the value chain. So unlike reducing your own scope 1 and 2 emissions, where you tend to have more control, the level of control and influence that you have will vary across your wider value chain emissions. So typically the level of control and influence will diminish the further up and down the value chain you go. So think, for example, tier 1 versus tier 2 suppliers, etc. So there is a lot of discourse emerging on the methods for tackling this, and it's often referred to as making value chain interventions. So this is where that direct supplier engagement becomes so important, and making sure that all parties involved understand your common objectives to reduce your emissions and how this can be done. So this might require partnerships and or working groups to have some impact. Now, also, if there is a common set of suppliers to the whole sector, then there's an opportunity for sector collaboration to identify opportunities, and also importantly, to reduce duplication of effort. So yeah, thinking about where your projects sit up and down your value chain is an important consideration. Okay, so back to shortlisting. So at a simple level, you might find it useful to label your projects based on, for example, what's common and accessible right now, what's emerging and available soon, and then more over the horizon options. And you can supplement that with cost variables, what type of change it is, and so on. And these things can help you to prioritize which opportunities to pursue within a set timeline and within budget constraints. So in this example, for example, we've got an initiative to promote fuel-efficient driving behavior, and we've identified that as a low-cost behavioral change that's available now, and so on. So that will help you to prioritize the types of projects you undertake. And so by now you'll be getting quite close to being able to map out where the projects could sit on a time horizon between now and your target year, and the costs and reduction potential are, and also general feeling on the confidence of project success. So some of the things you'll identify as being the ones in the green are, high certainty, things you can do in the short term, etc., down to other initiatives which are going to have more uncertainty around them, and less confidence that they'll be completed. But overall, those projects will add up to give you an overall reduction as you go along. And so you can then take those projects and put them into a sort of graphical chart form. And each on this chart, we can see we've mapped the desired reductions to meet the target in the dotted line, and then the actual projected pathway based on the projects that we've identified. We can then take a list of our emission sources, base year emission, and the chosen reduction projects. And it's worth noting here that we may also include not only reductions, but increases. So for example, in this case, if we were to switch from overseas sourcing to local sourcing, we may be reducing sea freight, but we may have a small increase in road freight. So we would reflect that as an increase here. We would then map out the year in which those activities are intended to take place, along with the basis of reduction, either percentage or tons of CO2, and the expected change that we hope to see. It's worth allocating each of those initiatives against the scope, because that will help us later on when we're splitting between scope 1 and 2, scope 3 value chain reductions, and so on. And then finally, we convert all the emissions to a common unit. So in this case, the expected savings in tons. So step 2 in that is then to map out those projected savings across the source categories and by year of action. And you may find in some cases that it's useful to go down to a more granular level for a particular emission sources, like we've done here for mobile combustion. And then depending on your intended users, you may need to project your purchased energy, your scope 2, in the form of what's called either location-based or market-based. And typically we find that most organizations will project and plot by the broad groupings that they use to set their targets. So scope 1 and 2 combined, and then a total of scope 3. But sometimes they will set sub-targets within scope 3 if, for example, a particular category was being done through supplier engagement and so on. So now, once you've identified what the savings are per year or the reductions per year, you can then deduct them from your base year emissions. And this basically allows you to arrive at your forecast emissions at the end of your target timeline, if all of your projects are successful. once again, you can then map them out. And so here, for example, we can see that there's a gap between the plotted pathway and the desired target. So in this case, you would circle back to looking for more reduction projects and refine your plan and your pathway over time to close that gap. Over time, you can then plot your actual performance, in this case in the purple line, and continually review and adjust your reduction plan to stay on track. So in this example, there was a gap. We identified an additional reduction activity in 2026, and that had the impact of reducing that gap towards the end of the target period. Okay, so that's kind of the process that you follow in terms of being able to map out your reduction pathway. The next stage in the process, I won't cover it in too much detail, is around confirming and implementing. So these are just standard things to make sure that your projects you've identified are actually implemented. And there are a number of ways of carrying out your pathway plotting. So, for example, there are a number of free tools available, like the Climate Action Toolbox. The CNGP have a pathway plotting tool. And then, of course, Toitū have specific tools that we supply to our clients to carry out their mapping. So, yep, time's up. So thank you for that, and look forward to answering any questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Steve, for the presentation. Very interesting and relevant, I think, for many of us. And I think it's relevant for those that have set science-based targets. And the reason I'm a big fan of science-based targets, having been involved with lots of sustainability target setting in the past, is that you set the target, then you work out the pathway. So it means you have to look under every rock and be incredibly thorough, rather than just looking to see what you think you can do and then slapping a target on what you're probably going to achieve anyway. So I think there's been a fantastic development in the sustainability community over the last 5 years or so, and they're driving so much action. The other thing that resonated with me is making sure you're measuring the right thing, and we can get obsessed with measurement and reporting, but coming back to the fact that you should be measuring things that motivate you to make a difference and make change as well. So that's always one of the principles we have here, is this is about actually reducing our emissions. So when we're measuring something, make sure we're measuring it in a way that's going to drive action and sends the right signals to the business. So yeah, I've picked up a few tips. Thank you. So now I think there are some Q&As coming through, but I think we're going to save the Q&A to the end. So we'll switch to introducing Jamie now. So to give us a corporate example of what Steve just talked to, we're joined by Jamie from Toyota. So Jamie's got a background in physics, and from a career in teaching, joined Toyota's business planning and sustainability teams at the start of 2021. So with Stu and Toitū support, Jamie expanded Toyota's emissions measurement to include all of Scope 3, and also helped convince the Toyota executive team to commit to align with a 1.5 degree pathway across all scopes, which is impressive. So I'll hand over to Jamie now.
Fantastic, thank you. Again, hopefully if that's, can I get a thumbs up from a few people if that's sharing? Fantastic. So as mentioned, my name's Jamie Reid. I'm a business planner and sustainability data analyst for Toyota New Zealand. I think what I was thinking would be most beneficial is talking about maybe more in an abstract sense about how we manage that process, rather than specifics around like, this is the action we took and that was the action we took, etc., to help people on their journey for science-based targets and how that felt in the business. So a brief summary here in terms of, I mean, if we're all here agreeing that science-based targets are and emissions reductions are a net benefit and a positive for everybody, but there's a difference between thinking it's a good idea and actually committing to it and getting the business across the line to make those commitments and actually join on board. And so there's a motivational psychology piece there with a carrot and a stick. And then once we've decided to actually make that commitment, what did we commit to and why? And effectively the key point here was just simplification. I think a lot of the information, particularly in a large corporation, you can get muddled up as people talk to each other and as that information gets distributed around. So how did we simplify the message to make sure we're trying to get as much buy-in as possible to move that forward? And then lastly, which I think probably more relevant to today's topic, is how will Toyota actually need to change to meet those longer term targets. So the first one here being, how did we actually get exec across the line? And I think the automotive industry in particular has a big target on its back. And so the regulations have probably come for us sooner than for most other businesses. But like New Zealand is a part of the UN and relies pretty heavily on its clean green imagery. So it's committed to a 1.5 degree, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees as well. So from our perspective, it's not really a matter of if, but when the regulation is going to be coming to shimmy along the corporations and companies that are lagging behind in the space. In a Toyota perspective, though, we're a company very much based in that sort of like pride and dignity. And so we found getting engagement from the carrot side of things, like why is this good? You know, how can we be leaders in this space, be more effective for our exec and upper management? And I've linked this in here with, we've got some internal sort of code of conduct pieces like act for others, work with integrity, continue the quest for improvement, sort of internal Toyota speak to help guide that code, but that fed the carrot to help us get everybody involved and get the exec across there. So effectively, we know it's the right thing to do. We're going to try and reduce our emissions. And within that, the sustainability, the genuine engagement and sustainability becomes linked with our product itself, becomes part of the product, so it should increase profitability and brand gain. Obviously, the stick associated with that is that if we don't actually back up all the green sustainability advertising, then we're going to lose customers. Effectively, we're not going to get as much engagement from them. And at a more personal level for those people making the decisions and actually getting the commitment across is that, I mean, we've got the sustainability development goals, Toyota Environmental Challenge, and our branding. If they can move the sustainability piece forward, it can be a feather in their cap. Or if they hold back, it might be a mark against their reputation. So those were sort of motivations to get our exec to actually commit and get the upper management to buy in and be, yes, we can do this. This is the right thing to do. And then you kind of go, well, how are we going to do that? How are we going to actually manage the transition? From our side, we wanted to take a gold standard approach to this, because I think there are a couple of other ways that you could and programs you can go for reducing emissions. But as far as we could tell, science-based targets and the Toitū audits are the gold standard, and particularly because the science-based targets are for that 1.5 degrees, or at least for scope 1 and scope 2 in the near term, and that is what the government is aiming for. So if our target's the same as what the government's aiming for, we should be able to stay ahead of those regulations there. The secondary thing was about, again, trying to get the targets, the messaging the same across all of our departments and across all the managers. So keep the message as simple as possible. So we committed to that 1.5 degrees and for the absolute reduction instead of any intensity ones, because we want to set the target once, start on the pathway, and try and get to that 2050 goal from where we are now, rather than changing halfway through. And I think that fed into some of the perverse outcomes that Steve was talking about before, in terms of you might be able to get a short-term gain, but you want to make sure that you don't lose sight of what's happening down at the very end. The other side of that, again, with the regulations coming behind us, is that if we can get ahead of where they are, if we can set those really ambitious longer term targets, then we can manage our own transition ahead of any regulations that are coming in and get more engagement from customers as well. So effectively, we're going to try and manage that transition as will be easier. And if we do come up across any difficult sticking points or areas where we're not able to reduce as much, hopefully because we're trying to work ahead of the big stick, we have some leeway to work with before it becomes a more serious issue, which leads into, unfortunately, the importing and distributing lots and lots of vehicles isn't a very sustainable business model. So the actual psychological change internally so that we can engage in that pathway and make it to 2050 requires a bit of an identity change. So instead of being a car retailer, we've had to move into being a mobility company. And again, thinking about, what does Toyota do? We add value to our customers, and the value we add is mobility, and we do that currently by selling vehicles. And you can get quite stuck in a Toyota as a car selling company, and effectively what we're wanting to do, we're trying to lay the groundwork now, because we can't be doing that in 2050. We'll probably have to keep doing that for a while yet, but we can make other emissions reductions in the meantime. But we need to change that identity now, so that when we do need to change, and when we do find all those other revenue streams and really get into being a proper circular economy business, we're not hamstrung by, but Toyota's a car company. So we're trying to put the groundwork in now to be Toyota is a mobility company. Mobility is a service we provide. Mobility is the value that we add for our customers. That's what Toyota is, so that that leaves a real open landscape for our employees and our managers to think of alternative ways of finding revenue and alternative ways of doing things. So by broadening out that scope, we're more open to find what those alternative pathways might be. And I think on that note as well, the benefit of keeping a very simple 1.5 degrees, 46% reduction by 2030, or the 4.2% per annum, is that's a means of distributing responsibility amongst all of the managers throughout the company, so that everybody has effectively the same target. Everybody can find pathways that they, can influence and control over and sort of pass them up. But it's about getting that cross-department buy-in into the target, and then each individual who is closest to their area of expertise can find reduction pathways for that area, and those should all sum up into achieving that full goal for the company. So again, summarizing again, effectively it was the carrot and the stick. It's a great idea, sustainability, reducing emissions, but how do we get people actually across the line? And for a Toyota, as an aspirational company and sort of a leader in vehicle sales, we found the carrot, it's the right thing to do. We can gain more customers. Let's get ahead of the game here, more effective. We committed to very simple targets for the long term. We're just trying to stick with the 1.5 degrees, absolute reduction, so that we can keep the same targets throughout that transition as best as possible. And then also that we can distribute responsibility amongst everybody to get input from all parts of the business, rather than having a single person, the sustainability team lead it. We're trying to get buy-in from everybody there. And then Toyota's needed to change, take a step back from we're selling vehicles to we're a mobility company, so that we're trying to create an environment where if we don't know how to reduce an emission yet, our identity is broad enough that people have liberties to actually come up with those new ideas and innovations and ways that they can reduce those emissions. So thank you. That was the summary there. I think pass back to Steve or Tom.
I think it's coming back to me. Thanks, Jamie. Really interesting. I think there's lots of us who work in sectors who think we've got a lot to do around climate change, but the industry you're in, Toyota, is one that's really got a lot of change and a lot of challenges ahead. And I think the transformational challenge and the way you're approaching it by shifting from being a company that sells cars to being a mobility company is a really interesting way of actually thinking about how that shift's got to go. And it sounds like, it's fascinating. Lots of us are dealing with incremental change, and you've got a real transformation to deal with. Also enjoying the carrot and the stick. And I think the way you're positioning it, it's almost giving that sort of distributed leadership, empowerment to the business to keep rolling on there. So fascinating. Yeah, I think we're going to switch to the Q&A session now. We can see some Q&As rolling in below, and I'll open them up and have a look at the first one. And I think this is a question for you, Steve, related to your presentation, because it came in while you were speaking. But the supplier engagement process you mentioned, is that normally done by the procurement teams, or does the sustainability team normally take the lead on that kind of process? I think you're on mute.
Yep, there we go. Yes, I think it'll vary from one organisation to the next, and often it may well be a collaboration between the two. Obviously, your procurement team has that relationship with suppliers, But a lot of the technical aspects are going to come from your sustainability people.
Great, yeah. I think it depends is the answer in lots of these things. There's probably an upskilling in procurement and sustainability from sustainability teams that comes through those first rounds of engagement, and then it's something that can be then taken over and owned there. I'm not sure. Oh, wow, huge burst. A question from another anonymous question. When do you suggest it's time to reset an SBT? Would it be when an organization moves from measuring scope 1 and 2 only, and expanding to scope 3? Is that when it suggests resetting SBTs?
Yep, Stu or Austin, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yep, yeah, Stu here. I can do that one. Yeah, so if we're just talking about the actual science-based targets, you will, in the target setting process, you will have set a target year. So the obvious time to reset is once you get to the target year, so for example, 2030. However, if you have material changes in your inventory or acquisitions or divestments in your business, you may want to reconsider and define whether you need to reassess and reset. Do keep in mind that this is then supplemented with the reduction pathway that Steve covered on all the slides, and the need to just constantly evaluate that reduction pathway and mapping out and saying, for example, if there's new technologies come along that you hadn't anticipated in your base year, then keep bringing that into the pathway and reevaluating, where is that going to land in terms of your targets, and whether that justifies any resetting of the final target as well.
Great. A question from Alana. How can we navigate the influence on anticipated future technology on long-term targets, i.e. what's the balance of ambition and certainty? I think it's very another question for someone at Toitū. Or Jamie, if you want to take it.
Oh, well, I wanted to add maybe a piece there. I think one of the issues we come to in particular there, because obviously mobility solutions are available, and electric vehicles and hydrogen investment, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of really exciting new technologies on the horizon for mobility and vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. But that is a big unknown. But one of the issues we've come to, particularly in, again, convincing the exec to actually commit to this, is that there's a massive known risk for us, if we don't make those changes, we're not going to make it to 2050 anyway. And so there's a massive known risk, and there's some certainty and comfort in the fact that you know exactly what's going to happen there, whereas the unknown risk and opportunities can be a bit scary because they're unknown. But effectively, for us, we just need to hope that that's going to happen. Obviously, we have lots of planning involved, what we think might happen, but we don't know exactly which one we're going to be able to follow in that sense. But that's the certainty of risk versus uncertainty of potential opportunities in the future.
I think in some ways it's a balancing act the country's making as well. And if you look at the Climate Change Commission's advice to government and the emissions reduction plan, and we're interested because we're a digital technology innovation company as well. A lot of the modeling and the emissions reduction plans are based on current known technologies, and we know we can change, and we know we can do it in a way that doesn't impact GDP in any sort of material way. So it's wrong to wait for future technologies to stop acting now. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't be focusing on future technologies, because they could accelerate the pace of change. They could do it cheaper. They could do different things as well. So you've got to do everything you can now, but then also make sure you're not closing off the option for future technologies too. But the time is gone for us waiting for silver bullets and solutions that may not emerge. So it's that kind of parallel path that we need to tread there as well.
Just to jump in there, so quite a few of the clients that I work with, they all have this, fear of the uncertainty bit. And I think often they don't appreciate the work that's going on in, the wider society. So, for example, they may be a business that does a lot of air travel. And so they think, there's nothing I can do about that. But they don't factor in that Air New Zealand is doing a lot of work around sustainable, aviation fuels, electrification, and all that kind of thing. So in many cases, things that they may have no idea how they're going to achieve those targets, a lot of the things happening around them will assist them in that process. So yeah, often you have to take a bit of a leap of faith that everybody's working, or hopefully everybody's working on the same problems, and the solutions will help all of us.
Great. I can see a couple of questions coming through in the chat, which is fine. Probably put them in the Q&A if possible, so we can keep track of them. But one here from Josephine. Ecotricity provides climate positive 100% renewable electricity. Does Scope 2 market-based electricity count for SBTI reductions? Steve or Toitū? I know the answer, but I'll let you answer it more thoroughly. Yeah.
Stu here. So currently SBTI do allow market-based electricity as a way of demonstrating reductions in that Scope 2 space. Do keep track of SBTI definition developments. They are going through a review phase and just tracking how to ensure integrity of market-based mechanisms, not just in Scope 2, but in Scope 3 value chain interventions as well. It's going to be an interesting space to see where it all slots into the accounting. So it'll just be watch the space and see how it develops.
Yeah, at Spark, we're watching it very closely because I'm very jealously looking, Steve, at some of your reduction pathways. We as a business and industry are investing in more infrastructure, 5G, data centers, etc. And we know that technology's got an impact in actually supporting other industries to innovate and reduce their emissions. So it's infrastructure that's valuable for New Zealand, but it is energy use is projected to grow. So in terms of those two levers, we're trying to pull as hard as we can on the intensity lever, and that's where supplier engagement comes in, working with our energy partners to see how through our procurement, because we're a significant user of electricity, can we support them to increase investment in renewables and looking at renewables on our sites as well. But yes, within the tech sector, we need to be able to invest in renewables via grid-based mechanisms in order to achieve our targets. And in fact, there is industry-specific guidance for telecommunications and IT sector. So our reduction pathway is 56%, not the sort of standard 50, because there's recognition that we have additional tools, and a lot of copper-based old networks are coming out of our systems as well. So the great thing about science-based targets is that it's tailored somewhat to your industry. So we've got a harder target than most because we've got more tools available and less momentum in old technology. But yeah, that growth is challenging. Have you got any more questions? Any more questions in chat? Feel free to keep things coming through on the chat as well if you want to share information. Have we got any hands raised for live questions as well? No. Oh, here we go. A question for Toitū, and it's a response to a question I think you've already answered in chat, but somebody says, can we buy vehicles and not have to consider embedded carbon footprint?
To clarify that, so that's, can we buy vehicles and not have to consider embedded carbon footprint?
Yeah, I think that's probably not from a Toyota perspective, but from a reporting entity. How do you account for the embedded emissions in vehicles you're purchasing and bringing into your fleets?
Currently we account for them, and I think Stu helped us quite a lot with this in terms of more general emissions factors for production of a vehicle. With Toyota Japan having just committed to science-based targets as well, we're hoping to get more information specifically for different model types, etc., etc. I mean, one of the things there is that the emissions associated, again, right now are for more of a linear economy perspective. As we build that into, better recycling and getting more to the circular economy goal for 2050, then the intensity of the embodied emissions should decrease as we're starting to recycle and reuse those components more and more effectively for the long term. So hopefully that answers the question.
Hi, Jamie. Marcus here. I'm sitting next to Stacey. That question was based around, we purchase all our vehicles because it's the most economical model for our ratepayer. But my question as a fleet manager, where it's the dirtiest part of our organization. Basically 86% of our carbon footprint is our fleet, and so yes, we have certain targets that we have to meet and certain outputs that we have to achieve, and therefore we are led down the road of the cleanest utes because we need four-wheel drive, we need the carriage, etc. But where we don't need that, yes, there's a lot of debate around the efficacy of electric vehicles, and everyone's pushing. But when you look at a lifespan of a vehicle, for me as a fleet manager, we, even with sorry to mention it, but a Ford Ranger, which is the cleanest ute, we don't get to 60 tons of carbon dioxide as a footprint, even when we include the embedded carbon footprint. Whereas an electric vehicle, a Leaf with only a quarter of the range, starts at 69 tons because it's all imported to this country, and the cost of getting all the materials to make the battery, etc. So this is where I'm really sort of struggling. Do I focus on the hybrid because the embedded carbon footprint is less and the fuel economy is less, better, and it's cleaner? Or do I actually try and convince my staff that electric is the way forward, where it actually meets requirements, which is, very few places. So that's where that sort of question was coming in from.
Right. There's quite a few pieces there. There was from the real question there is around the at least from the input that I can add there, I think, is the proportion of the emissions that come from embedded versus use of the vehicle. From a Toyota perspective, when we're talking about our emissions, we have to consider the full lifetime of that vehicle being sold. And I imagine as a fleet manager, you'd be sort of, on selling the vehicle after it's served its use purposes there. So I mean, for us, the embedded emissions are around 10% of the emissions associated with the vehicle. So actually, embedded emissions are about 10% of our total carbon footprint, and the tailpipe emissions are currently around 85% of our emissions there. Yeah, so I mean, it might be worthwhile even maybe contacting talking with me outside of the stream, taking this offline to get more specific advice for your circumstances there.
Can I just compliment Jamie's answer there? And this does circle back to the importance of full value chain accounting, whatever industry you're in. And it's not just for the vehicles, right? It's any purchased goods and services, or you're constructing a building. What's the emissions footprint of those materials that you're acquiring, so that you've got full visibility on a full life cycle basis, so that you don't go and say, yeah, I've ticked the box, I've reduced emissions from the use phase of this, but you're not seeing the whole picture of those upstream emissions. And to circle back to an example people might be familiar with is the Volvo example. Volvo did the value chain analysis. They identified that steel was a big component of their emissions. They did supplier engagement, and they worked out to say, okay, well, here's a steel maker. How can we produce that steel in a lower carbon way? Okay, so that's just a little pilot test case example of that in practice.
To give a Spark example, we're transitioning our fleet to EV as well, and I think we operate on a lease rather than a buy model, and 3 or 4 year leases. Shifting to EVs, we know that there's a higher embedded footprint in the EVs coming in, and after they've been with us for a few years, we're probably at the stage at which they start to become positive relative to an ICE car. But then we recognise there's probably another 15 years they're going to be in the New Zealand fleet. So what we don't want to do, what we're trying to avoid to do is be a driver of more ICE cars coming in and polluting in New Zealand for 20 years. So we recognise as an organisation that's able to create demand for new vehicles, that we've got this responsibility for the full life cycle emissions of that vehicle too. So that's where we changed that. A few more questions coming through. One from Jen Cook. What tools do you use or recommend to support your carbon accounting? I actually asked Jamie first what Toyota use.
We use ESP. I think they just rebranded as BraveGen for ours, and I think the benefit there is because we have so many inputs and so many stakeholders that need to get data from. It sort of automates the process of sending emails, reminding them, requesting the data in, and so if they have an Excel spreadsheet which some office is tracking just their emissions, their bins or anything else, that Excel spreadsheet comes and it extracts the data from there. And associates, one bin bag equals 0.000 whatever tons of carbon, and so it tries to automate as much of that as possible. But yeah, so we use BraveGen and ESP, which I can see a couple of logos in the screens
Any comment from Toitū as well? No, you're both unmuted, but you're not saying anything, so I'll move on to a different question. And it's circling back around to renewable energy. So what do you see the role of RECs, renewable energy certificates, as reduction mechanisms going forward?
Oh, I can take that one again. So it's the same comment, same answer to the one to Josephine. So RECs is just another form of market-based accounting. I'll just put one extra comment, is that when you look through all the SBTI validated companies, I don't have the stats on hand, but there's a lot of validated companies that are stating are going to be using market-based electricity or RECs as a way to demonstrate their reductions. So it's a big feature.
Great. There's a question which has been answered, I think, which is, can you show the tool slide again at some point, please? I think we're planning to share materials after the end of the session. We've got 3 minutes left. It's probably going to take me 2 minutes to close, but I can just ask one very quick question of Steve and Jamie, unless we've got any more questions popping in. No, a very quick fire answer. What would be one tip from each of you to help organizations who are stepping out on these journey of setting a science-based target? Jamie, do you want to go first to put you on the spot?
One tip. I mean, all of these measurements and metrics are scaffolding to reduce the emissions. The ultimate goal here is reduction of the emissions. And I think so long as you keep the end target in mind, that we're doing this for this reason, because all the scaffolding, all the SBTs, all the rest of it, they're models. They're not exactly right, but they're helpful for reducing emissions. But I think it's making sure that it's just to help you reduce emissions. That's the main goal. So when you're navigating this space, yeah, make sure you keep the end goal in mind.
Nicely said. And Steve or Stu, do you want to take one tip from Toitū's perspective?
Can do. So yeah, I think given the complexities and the unknowns around the full value chain measurement, the importance of working with your suppliers to A, being able to get better data from them, and B, getting them on their own journey to measure, set targets and make reductions, really is the only way that we're going to reach the end goal, is if we're all working on it collectively.
Great. No, perfect. A massive thank you to Jamie, Steve, Stu, and the entire team at Toitū Envirocare for the work in preparing for the masterclass. I think it's great to join forces. Been great to join forces in the last two masterclasses. And I think the technical expertise, and this is an area that needs a lot of technical expertise, and the contribution you're making to Aotearoa's decarbonisation is invaluable. And thanks to Jamie for sharing Toyota's journey to align to 1.5 degrees. I really enjoyed the way you're thinking about it from an entire transformation perspective. And it's always insightful, and you always learn from hearing from how other organizations are working towards these things, and also getting senior leader approval for greater levels of climate ambition. So I think we're going to share a recording of today's session, and the presentation slides will be available to everybody as well. The next masterclass is on May the 25th, and I think further details will be provided. I think there'll be an email coming out, so keep your eyes out for that. So it's always heartening to see the level of engagement of CLC signatories and Toitū clients in accelerating climate ambition. And so with that, thank you everybody, and ka kite anō.